When you book a night away in a luxury 5-star hotel, ghosts would be the furthest thing from your mind, right? I mean, private fine dining, spa treatments with 24-karat gold-infused body oil, and chauffeured airport transports in a Rolls-Royce Phantom, they're not exactly reminiscent of a cold, drafty, abandoned haunted house full of ghostly apparitions and unexplained bumps in the night. But it seems like if you're staying at the Langham Hotel in London, you could be signing yourself up for the best of both worlds. Because the prestigious hotel in the West End is said to be the most haunted in the city, with multiple entities reported all over the building, from a phantom figure in a Victorian suit to a ghostly doorman from another time entirely. So while you're sipping on your champagne, you might just feel a cold chill that's definitely not on the drinks menu. In the 19th century, the City of London was booming. The population of Greater London was swelling by the year. It was already seen as this powerhouse at the centre of the British Empire. But considering the amount of important people that would have been travelling to London on business, the city seemed to be severely lacking luxury hotels and fine dining in the mid-1800s. And a city of this scale and this importance needed accommodation for these high-flying figures of society. London's first hotel of its kind, the Great Western Railway Royal Hotel, and try saying that mouthful after a few bottles of champers, was opened in 1852 and was an instant hit. It was exactly what these higher class travellers and socialites were looking for, a hotel to rival the facilities of the great hotels on the continent. 12 years later, the Charing Cross Hotel opened up, but it still wasn't enough to meet demand. In the early 1860s, the Langham Hotel Company was formed to acquire a patch of land in the highly sought after area of Marylebone, and they wanted to build a hotel so magnificent it would blow the other hotels out of the water. They held a competition to design the hotel, which architect John Giles comfortably won with his stunning drawings, and the hotel began construction in July 1863. They'd already decided to name the hotel the Langham Hotel after a guy called Sir James Langham, who had previously had a mansion built on this plot of land. Because Langham House had actually been built in 1816, and there's actually a few letters between James and the guy who built the house for him, John Nash. And they were going back and forth about a bunch of issues with the house. There was damp, there was cracks in the plaster, all sorts of things that he wasn't happy with. New builds, nothing changes, clearly. But anyway, the Langhams must have been reasonably happy here as they stayed here for a few years until 1833, where the property was then sold on to the Countess of Mansfield, who sold it to the Langham Hotel Company in 1860. And the hotel that they wanted to build, it was going to be this huge, great big grand affair. It was styled after a Florentine palace and just dripping in luxury from the inside out. The building was expected to take 15 months to complete, and they were looking to welcome their first guests in March 1864. However, things were delayed. But based on everything that I've learned in my short time running this channel and bringing you these stories, there couldn't have been a better reason for the hotel to be delayed, because they wanted to make sure that it was as safe from fire as possible. Eventually they ended up with an artesian well that fed water to the hose points on every floor, and there was an electric fire alarm system that would notify 4 fully trained firemen who were permanently stationed at the hotel, telling them exactly where the fire was in the building. Because based on the few stories that I've told you about previously, it can't just be me that feels good to know that all of this fire safety was a thing, right? It had obviously also been built with all kinds of high-class luxuries. We're talking electric lighting, hydraulic lifts, even air conditioning. And the building was finally ready for its opening date in June 1865, and the grand opening itself was a bit of a spectacle. Prince Edward, the future King Edward VII, he rocked up to the celebration, as well as everyone who was anyone in Victorian high society at the time. And from that moment on, the Langham Hotel was the place to be. It was a favourite venue for royalty, artists, musicians, socialites, the upper echelons of society. And I mean, all that luxury, it obviously had the price tag to match. Even Charles Dickens was stated as saying that it was the most expensive hotel meal in London. But if you were going to be hosting a big fancy dinner party with all of your rich mates, there was nowhere else that would have even come close to a night at the Langham. Despite everything though, all the best laid plans and all of that, no one could have prepared for what was to come. The country was heading into financial difficulty, as 1866 was the year of the overend currency crisis, which was a huge international financial downturn. And then to make matters even worse, the American Civil War had obviously ended the previous year, and that in itself is obviously not a bad thing, but instead of travelling abroad and taking in the luxury, American tourists who could afford to travel were instead staying at home and helping to rebuild their country. As a result, the Langham Hotel Company went bankrupt in 1868. But all is not lost. The story doesn't end there. An investment company swooped in and bought the hotel for almost £156,000, which, I mean, if you can afford it, buying a luxury hotel for 50 pence on the pound, that is a steal. With some new blood on the board of directors, and with the expertise of a new manager, a guy called James Sanderson, London, it seemed like this was the start of a fresh new chapter for the hotel. Sanderson wasted no time in getting things back on track, and almost immediately, the Langham was this place to see and be seen again. And it also now seemed to attract a new clientele, as James Sanderson had come over from the States, and so American guests would say that they felt like the Langham was a home away from home. The American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, as well as Mark Twain, were known to enjoy the hospitality of the Langham Hotel, and I found it quite funny that apparently Charles Dickens Jr., so obviously the famous novelist's son, he wrote in his Dictionary of London in 1879 that the hotel had become a special American resort because there were that many American guests staying there. But of course it wasn't just Americans. It's thought that Oscar Wilde was commissioned to write The Picture of Dorian Gray here after a dinner meeting with a magazine editor, although it has got to be mentioned that once he was released from prison after serving 2 years for homosexuality, which at that time was a crime under gross indecency, the Langham Hotel apparently basically barred his entry and wouldn't let him come back. And then there was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who didn't actually stay at the hotel as he lived fairly locally, but he was so inspired by the hotel that he actually used it in a few of his Sherlock Holmes stories. There was A Scandal in Bohemia, The Sign of Four, and The Disappearance of Lady Frances Carfax. As we moved into the 20th century though, there was more trouble ahead, mainly the First World War. During this time, a lot of those big grand hotels had been converted into hospitals or were being used by the government for the war effort. And so it's pretty amazing that the Langham was actually able to stay open as a hotel, even as the world was changing all around it. That said though, the Great War obviously took its toll. There were less guests checking in, which means lost revenue. And that shine of glamour that the Langham had been known for, it kind of faded a little bit. After the war in the 1920s, the hotel received a bit of a facelift, but it wasn't to pre-war standards. It was even starting to look a little shabby. The younger crowd, they were choosing to go to the newer hotels like the Ritz, the Savoy, the Dorchester, while it was their parents, the older crowd who had always been loyal to the Langham. They stuck with what they knew. In the 30s, the BBC had opened up the Broadcasting House, and even though they'd opened that up in 1932, they were already looking for more space. And so by 1934, they were in talks to buy the hotel. I mean, it's super close, super convenient, makes sense. After months of negotiations though, the deal never quite came together, and so that was that. The Langham continued to do what it could to keep going. With the outbreak of World War II though, things took a more drastic turn for the hotel. Their rich English clientele weren't going to go venturing into the capital city for a holiday, they were going to go stay safe out in the countryside. And similarly, tourism from America and Europe was practically non-existent. But the hotel did stay open as a post and first aid station, with rooms being occupied by officers on leave, BBC wartime staff, and anyone else involved in broadcasting from the studios. In 1940 though, the hotel was hit hard during the Blitz, with 2 bombs in September and 1 bomb dropped in December, causing fires, flooding, damage to the gas mains. It was just a mess. And these bombs left most of the West Wing completely destroyed, and so the hotel was too damaged to stay open, and so it finally shut its doors. By 1943, the BBC was back at the table. They were still growing and expanding, and again, they had a need for more space. And so, yet again, they were looking at the Langham Hotel. But for a second time, the negotiations fell apart when the hotel wanted more money than the BBC were willing to offer them. But after the Second World War had ended, London's hotel scene was looking very different from what it had been during Langham's former glory days. Of the 110 hotels that had been listed by Baedeker in 1900, apparently only 11 were still going. And in case you're wondering what Baedeker is, it's basically like a TripAdvisor of the time. It was a famous travel guidebook. In 1945, despite not coming to a deal about buying the place, the BBC was given permission to use the now closed Langham Hotel. And so they took over the south and west sides, as well as the entire ground floor and basement. And they auctioned off anything that they didn't need, all of this luxury hotel furniture, but they did keep the rooms on the 3rd floor furnished for any visiting correspondents or any journalists with a late finish or an early start, because for those guys it would make more sense to sleep closer to work rather than commuting home. They also turned the Palm Court into the BBC's reference library, and it basically just became that extra space, the extension that the broadcasting house needed. By 1965, the BBC fully purchased Langham Hotel, and they continued working out of there for the next few decades. However, by 1982, the BBC were on the hunt for more space yet again, and so they actually proposed plans to have the Langham Hotel demolished so that they could replace it with a bigger, more modern building. Thankfully, that didn't happen. In 1986, the Ladbroke Group bought the place off the BBC for the cool sum of £26 million, and after acquiring the Hilton International brand not too long after that, they got straight to work sinking another £100 million into restoring and renovating the old hotel. In 1991, it reopened once again as a luxury hotel known as the Langham Hilton, and it was back to business. It was the place to see and be seen yet again, with the likes of the Princess of Wales herself, Diana. She loved the hotel. The Duchess of Kent, the Duke of Edinburgh, even the Prime Minister John Major, he attended dinners there. In 2004, the Great Eagle Hotel Group came into the picture. they bought the hotel. The hotel went through another huge refurbishment project that was finished in 2009 at a cost of £80 million. The amount of money is just wild, honestly. But when you look at the clientele, you've got Lady Gaga, Angelina Jolie, Selena Gomez. It all makes sense. And so continuing to this day, the Langham Hotel has forged a reputation for being an incredibly luxurious, exclusive 5-star hotel, perfectly placed for catching a show at the West End or just living your best life with 24-karat gold massages. Honestly, they have gold-infused body oil and use gold hot stones. It's just another level of tax bracket that I cannot even fathom. But as much as the hotel perhaps wouldn't like to admit it, the Langham does also have a very different reputation too, as it's kind of notorious for how allegedly haunted it is. So let's start with the most famous ghost stories of the Langham Hotel, as they all centre around one room in particular, room 333. The first story involves a Victorian doctor who apparently checked into this room with his bride on their wedding night, only it wasn't the start of their happy ever after, as he murdered his new wife before taking his own life. And now the doctor supposedly manifests as a silver-haired Victorian gentleman dressed in a cloak and cravat, but it's his eyes, because they're said to be blank, dead, soulless staring eyes, which make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up just thinking about. In 1973, the BBC radio broadcaster James Alexander Gordon was staying over in room 333, because like I said, these rooms on the 3rd floor were used by BBC staff when they needed to stay close to broadcasting house. And so he was just there, he dropped off to sleep no problems, but he was woken up in the middle of the night. He just so happened to start looking around the room when he saw this weird fluorescent ball of light appear in the corner of the room. So he sat up in bed and he watched this light, but he hadn't left a light on in the room or anything, and anyway, this light was moving and it was forming into the shape of a man. Eventually, the figure was as clear as day. It was this Victorian gentleman. He was floating about 2 feet off the ground and he had his arms outstretched towards James, staring at him with those cold, unseeing eyes. James, not really knowing what on earth to make of all of this, called out to this figure, asking who it was, what on earth did it want, when it started floating, arms still outstretched towards James. Naturally, at this point, he did what I think anyone in that situation would do and bolted, faster than you can say no, absolutely not. He raced down to the lobby, half-dressed, and started babbling at the commissionaire at the front desk about what he'd just seen in his room. And he was begging this guy to come back up into the room with him to grab his stuff, as he was terrified. The attendant did not seem to be in the least bit amused by what James was saying, cutting him off by saying basically, with all due respect, we don't have ghosts. And even if we did, I'm not going back up into your room with you looking for them. I mean, what can you do? All of your stuff is still in the room. There's nowhere else for you to go. You kind of just got to suck it up and hope that it was the remnants of a nightmare. So James just took the lift back up to the 3rd floor, walked along the hallway to his room, and incredibly tentatively opened the door. In the darkened room, he could still just about make out that the figure was still there. It had faded. It wasn't quite as glow in the dark anymore, and it didn't acknowledge James this time. It just floated there, completely motionless, fading more and more until it was completely gone. Would you still go back and sleep in that room? Or would you just grab your wallet and go and find the nearest Premier Inn? I don't even think they had Premier Inns back then, but I don't think I would risk going back and sleeping in that room. Maybe a strong coffee and a nice little sofa nap in the lobby. I think that might do for me after that. But the next day, James obviously shows up for work and tells his broadcaster buddies what he had experienced the night before. A few of them kind of gave him a bit of a look, and it turns out it's because they admitted they'd seen the exact same thing in that room. Some people claim to have seen this apparition since, and it appears to be that he only manifests in October and it's only ever him, never his wife. Although it has got to be said, there is no story in any record about a Victorian murder at the Langham Hotel. But for some reason, this Victorian doctor isn't the only entity still allegedly hanging around in room 333. There is also the figure known as the German Prince. He was witnessed by, again, a BBC employee, Ray Moore, who described him as quite a beefy man, very stocky. He had cropped hair and was wearing a military-style jacket that was buttoned all the way up to his neck. Other people who have witnessed this entity over the years claim to most often see him in the early hours of the morning, and he's walking through the closed doors on the 3rd floor, usually stopping in room 333. He's also apparently been seen by people outside the hotel who are looking up into the windows, where they can quite clearly see this not of this era man in military uniform looking out of one of the windows on the 3rd floor. The story with this apparition is that he was a well-to-do German prince who was staying here just before the First World War broke out. When it was announced that war had been been declared, this man is said to have jumped from one of the windows on the 3rd floor. As far as I could tell, no newspaper reports, no records. So again, like Dr. Victorian Man, pinch of salt. But something else allegedly happens in room 333. Whether it's something to do with the doctor or the prince or something else, we don't know. But guests have sometimes reported the feeling that the bed they're sleeping in is being shaken so violently that they're gonna fall out. In May 2003, there was a woman staying in this room when she suddenly appeared down in the lobby in the middle of the night, had her bags all packed, silently checked out and walked out of the hotel without saying a single word as to what was going on. It was only when a letter arrived at the hotel from this guest where the staff found out why she'd left in the middle of the night in a hurry. She had said that she couldn't sleep because she was so terrified by whatever was haunting room 333 because it wouldn't stop shaking the bed. She didn't see anything, didn't hear anything, just something wouldn't leave the bed alone. And I get it, you're paying that much for a hotel room, the least you can expect is a stationary bed, right? So while we don't have a lot of solid, historically backed up context on what could be going on in room 333, it is obviously worth mentioning, whether you believe in it or not, the number itself, 333, does carry a bit of weight. It's said to represent the Holy Trinity, but then you double that number and well, 666, that's more than enough to get some people's imaginations going into overdrive, right? I don't know, I'm not 100% sure on how I feel about numerology. I know a very small amount about it, admittedly, but maybe the connection is more of a human bias looking for an explanation in the number of the room rather than anything specific going on there, as it is just the 33rd room on the 3rd floor, if that makes sense. But let me know what you think, because even if you don't stay in room 333, it seems like staying on the 3rd floor is where you're most likely to run the risk of a disturbed night's sleep, shall we say. And when you're paying that much for a hotel room, that may be something to bear in mind, especially if you're in the city for a specific reason where, you know, sleep is important. A bit like when the England cricket team was staying at the hotel in 2014. There was one guy, Stuart Broad, he was staying in his hotel room and it was just way too hot, he couldn't sleep. Which, I mean, it was during summer, so you know, that alone could just be down to the weather. You'd like to think that there would be good AC in a hotel that fancy, but there you go. And so he's just there, tossing and turning, cannot settle down. One of those nights where sleep is just not happening. And then things get weird. He said that the taps in his bathroom turned on by themselves. Okay. Big building, maybe just some plumbing weirdness. So he got up and went to the bathroom, and as he turned the lights on, the taps switched themselves off. Getting weirder now. Stuart just thinks, it's the middle of the night, I've got a cricket match in the morning, I'm not about to get into the hows and whys of this. So he turns the lights back off so that he can go back to bed. As soon as he turns the lights off, taps come back on, water gushing into the sink. Eventually, considering he was staying in London to do a job, namely winning a test match against Sri Lanka, and not getting any sleep was not going to help him do said job, he actually asked to switch rooms. But there was another encounter when he was woke up in the middle of the night, just with that overwhelming, sickening feeling like you're not alone. He looked at his phone and he saw that his teammate Matt Pryor was also online, so he just went over to Matt's room. Turns out, Matt was also going through exactly the same thing. Completely wide awake, unmistakable feeling like he's not alone in his room. And so Stuart actually ended up sleeping on the spare bed in Matt's twin room that night. That's how much both of these guys were affected by whatever was going on. But it wasn't just Stuart and Matt. Ben Stokes, he apparently got super creeped out by something in his room on the 3rd floor. And some of the wives and girlfriends of the cricketers, they would refuse to step foot in the building. They were so terrified afterwards. Other guests have also complained of this same sensation too, of having this subconscious sense like you're not alone in your room. Like there's someone you just can't see watching your every move in there. But the unsettling activity could start before you've even got to your room. There was one story of a woman who was staying at the hotel and she'd got checked in and left her bags with a porter, just gone up to her room. A bit of time went on and it was getting later in the evening and her bags still hadn't showed up. So she just called down to reception asking, oh, do you know where my bags are? I would have thought they'd made it up to my room by now. At which point the person on the front desk goes through all the details, what room she was in, all of that, but nope, nothing's coming up. No porter is reporting having your bags. Can you describe the man that you left your bags with? Well, actually, it's funny that you should say that. The porter did seem to be wearing quite a strange uniform, didn't really fit in with the rest of the staff. Okay, here we go. Apparently this woman goes on to describe the uniform that the porters used to wear in the early 20th century. Hadn't been worn for decades. So the staff go to where this woman spoke to this supposed porter and luckily found her bags exactly where she'd left them. But someone that you're probably more likely to remember encountering in the hallways if you see him is a man with apparently a huge gaping hole in his face. We don't know who he is or how he came to be injured like that, but some people have speculated that maybe it's someone who was was injured or even killed during the Blitz when the hotel got so badly damaged. It wouldn't be beyond the realms of imagination, and actually it's probably quite likely that people would have lost their lives in the area of the hotel where those bombs were dropped in 1940. There has also been a man wearing a dinner jacket seen wandering the hallways. Again, we don't know his story. Some believe that he's a butler, others think that he was a radio presenter off to somewhere fancy dressed up in his best jacket. But the only thing is he's got no shoes on, and so he's just silently padding around in his socks with holes in them. But one apparition that looks a lot more put together, albeit most definitely not of this century, or even the last, or even the one before that, is that of a footman who was apparently witnessed wearing a pale blue livery, which is basically what household staff would have worn as a uniform, and a powdered wig, so very 1700s, which would have been of the time when the land was part of a mansion rather than the hotel which is stood there now. This character was actually, again, witnessed during the time of the BBC, where it was claimed that he was seen in the reference library, which I think, looking at the information, was the Palm Court, so where the hotel hosts its afternoon tea now. And it said that you can usually tell that you're about to encounter him because he's accompanied by an unmistakable drop in temperature. But it would be really interesting to know if anyone has actually seen him since it became a hotel again. Maybe guests thinking that the staff are just really getting into the spirit of afternoon tea with 1700s costumes or something. But one place where guests don't usually venture down to, and yet there is a ghost story, is down in the basement. Of course there's a ghost story in the basement. It wouldn't be a haunted building without something creepy underground, right? But this one is actually really interesting because it's said that Emperor Napoleon III may haunt the hotel. And not Napoleon Bonaparte, which is who my mind immediately conjured up, but actually his nephew, who reigned as Emperor of France until 1870, until the end of the Second French Empire, where he then ended up living out the rest of his days in exile. And during that part of his life, he'd spent some time living at the Langham Hotel. And going from Emperor of France to not that, I can imagine that opens up huge holes in your diary, and I mean, you gotta fill it with something, right? So Napoleon roped in some of the off-duty hotel staff to help him gather random cast-off bits and pieces, stone fragments, building scraps, even old family coats of arms, just anything that he could get his hands on. And he built this huge, great big 20-foot sculpture, which he named La Fernerie, which apparently stayed on the hotel grounds for over a century. But now, for some reason, the exiled emperor allegedly haunts the basement of the Langham Hotel, and is said to be responsible for moving things down there, and you just get the sense like there's someone down there in the basement with you. It would just be really interesting to know why the basement, you know? While he lived there, he would have lived in a room like any other guest, not the basement. So let me know your theories in the comments for that one, because the Langham Hotel is an interesting example of an allegedly haunted building. There have been some skeptics that have, quite rightly, pointed out that an overwhelming number of these ghost stories appeared during the time of the BBC, when journalists, broadcasters and whatnot would have been staying at the hotel because of work and not for any leisure reason. And perhaps it's a little cynical, but could the ghost stories have been made up to get out of deadlines, maybe? I feel like you've got a better chance of telling your boss that your dog ate your homework rather than blaming ghosts, but you know. Because most of the staff, at least from what I can see nowadays, do not believe that the hotel is haunted, or at least they don't tell you that it's haunted. They don't play into it, they don't warn you that, oh, you're checking into a haunted room, nothing. There are even no TripAdvisor reviews saying that guests had had weird experiences in this hotel, which, as we learned from the Drovers Inn, turned out to be a great place to look when researching a haunted hotel. But I quite like all of that about this story. They don't have anything to gain from perpetuating the ghost stories. I mean, it's a 5-star luxury hotel. They probably want nothing to do with a reputation of being haunted. And yet there are still 1 or 2 modern day accounts of the hotel having ghosts, with people just experiencing weird things around the hotel. As while I do feel like the Langham Hotel in London is trying its hardest to distance itself from any mention of ghosts, the decades of stories and the accounts from guests staying in the current iteration of the hotel make me think that potentially, maybe, there may be some ghostly guests who haven't checked out. As to who they are, not a Scooby-Doo. The murder story is one big eyebrow raise. If it did happen, if a doctor had killed his wife during the Victorian era, we would have heard about it in newspaper reports from the time. It wouldn't have been difficult to find, it would have been high profile, so maybe that just needs a little bit more digging into for names, dates, room numbers, or maybe it's not the cause of the weird things going on in room 333. I do believe that a lot of the alleged activity, assuming that it did actually happen, is probably more of a residual type haunting. There's been a lot of history within those walls, so it would make sense. But as always, tell me your thoughts down below, and if you've stayed in the Langham Hotel, or you've worked there, or you've just had a weird experience that means you know without a shadow of a doubt that it is most definitely haunted, or even the other way too, you know that it is all made up and that these ghost stories aren't real, please do spill all of the tea in the comments. I would love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, please do give it a little like. And if you feel so inclined, you'd like to sit down and chat about ghosts a little bit more with me, then maybe you'd want to subscribe too. to. It would be very cool to have you back for another one. But anyway, that is all from me today. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. London's first hotel of its kind, the Great Western Railway, here we go. The Great Western Railway, the Great Western Railway, the Great Western Railway Royal Hotel, the Great Western Railway Royal Hotel.